Hey, so in today's lecture, we're going to be talking about those chemical groups, also known as functional groups. If you're a little concerned about this area of your studies, don't worry, I got you. Let's go ahead and get right into it. So the first chemical group that we'll talk about will be the hydroxyl group. And when it comes to the hydroxyl group, when you're looking at different molecules and compounds, you want to find that oxygen bound to a hydrogen, like so. When it comes to this hydroxyl group, this chemical group or functional group is polar. It also has hydrogens that love to bind with water, so it makes it a great dissolver for solutes. So when it comes to a solute, you can think of it as like Kool-Aid when we're talking about Kool-Aid. So the powdered part, the Kool-Aid is the solute, while the solvent is the water. So when we have the solute plus the solvent, we get a solution, which is Kool-Aid. Delicious. When it comes to these hydroxyl groups, they're really good with helping dissolve different solutes, so like salts, sugars. Lastly, when it comes to the hydroxyl group, they are added onto alcohols. A good example is ethanol. So on ethanol, you can see that hydroxyl group right there. Next, we have the carboxyl group. And when it comes to the carboxyl group and the next couple groups that we'll talk about, you want to look for a carbon double bonded to an oxygen, like so. And from there, so whenever you're looking at a molecule, make sure you're looking for that carbon double bonded to that oxygen. You just want to look at what's coming off of that. So if you see a hydroxyl group coming off of it, and then on the other side, you have the rest of the molecule. This is a carboxyl group. So a carboxyl group has a hydroxyl group on it. A really important function of a carboxyl group is to act as an acid. So when it's acting as an acid, what happens is sometimes that oxygen can completely take that electron from that hydrogen, and when it does that, it pops it off, it pops the hydrogen off of the molecule and into the solution, adding more hydrogen. So when you're upping the hydrogen concentration, it's becoming more of an acidic solution. When it comes to the carboxyl group, it also has a compound name, and you could see it as carboxylic acid. Next up, we have the carbonyl groups. So just like the carboxyl group, we have the carbon double bonded to an oxygen. But when it comes to the carbonyl group, yes, we're looking for that carbon double bonded to the oxygen, but it could come in two different forms. So we have a ketone, which is the carbon double bonded to the oxygen, and it's going to be in the middle of the carbon structure. So what you'll see is the rest of the molecule on both sides. So if you didn't know, the R that's in the box, that just stands for the rest of the molecule. So whatever else is going on with the molecule that we just don't have drawn here. So this is a ketone. The other type of carbonyl group that we can have is an aldehyde. And again, we want to look for that carbon double bonded to an oxygen, but instead of there being the rest of the molecule, you'll actually end the molecule with the hydrogen, while on the other side you'll have the rest of the molecule. So here, a good way to remember the aldehyde is to look for that hydrogen because there is an H in aldehyde. And when it comes to the aldehyde, the carbon double bonded to the oxygen is usually going to be at the end of the carbon structure. Before I get too far into this, I never even went over what is a chemical group. So when it comes to these chemical groups or functional groups, these are groups that are directly involved in chemical reactions. So when it comes to chemical reactions, we're either making or breaking bonds, so either building up bigger molecules or breaking molecules down. Let's go ahead and talk about the amino group. So when it comes to the amino group, you want to look for a nitrogen bound to hydrogens, a nitrogen bound to 2 hydrogens. What's cool about this amino functional group is that it acts as a base. So just like how the carboxyl group over here, it has a special function of acting as an acid. We have the amino group over here that has a special function of acting as a base. How it does that is how an acid will add hydrogens to a solution, increasing the concentration. A base will actually decrease the amount of hydrogens in the solution by picking them up. So actually this amino group can actually pick up an extra hydrogen, and by doing so it's acting as a base by decreasing that hydrogen concentration. When it comes to the amino group, it does have a compound name, and that's amine. All right, let's talk about that sulfhydryl group. So when it comes to the sulfhydryl group, you want to look for that sulfur bound to a hydrogen. When it comes to this functional group, it can actually cross-link proteins together. So that's really, really important to give us those strong bonds and holds within the protein structure. It creates what's known as a sulfur to sulfur bond, known as a disulfide bond. And this bond is extremely strong. It's usually seen in like hair perms. So if you ever had a hair perm where your hair was straight and you needed to make it curly, it's going to be actually making a lot of these bonds within your proteins of your hair to create those curls. Very, very cool. Lastly, when it comes to the sulfhydryl group, these are found in our cysteine amino acids. So if you look at the 20 essential amino acids, in the cysteine one, you'll find the sulfhydryl groups. We are almost there. The next one we'll talk about is the phosphate group. When it comes to this phosphate functional group, what it looks like, or what you'll want to try to identify, is the phosphate double bonded to an oxygen, single bonded to another oxygen, another bond to another oxygen, and lastly, one more oxygen. So when it comes to this phosphate group, they are extremely negative. So you can see all the negative charges going around it. Due to that negative charge, it makes it where this functional group can actually attach itself to other molecules. When it attaches itself to other molecules, let's use ADP as an example. So adenosine diphosphate, that means we just have 2 phosphate groups on it. That means this is kind of an inactive form of energy for our cells. So when we attach a 3rd phosphate group onto it, it now turns into ATP, which is an high energy molecule for our cells. So when we break off that 3rd phosphate group, it is actually going to release energy, and we can actually use that energy to do work for our cells. So the phosphate groups are directly involved with ATP. Last but not least, we'll talk about that methyl group. So when it comes to the methyl group, you want to look for a carbon bound to 3 hydrogens. When it comes to the methyl group, this one is actually the only chemical group that's not really chemically active. It is nonpolar and is usually used in gene expression, so it can control when a gene is turned on or off. All right, phew. We made it through those chemical groups and functional groups. So now let's go ahead and get into some identification practice. Let's take a look at this first molecule right here. What functional groups do you see? I definitely see some methyl groups going on here. So remember, each kind of bend or point is going to be a carbon. Even though it's not written, it's a carbon. So usually carbon is bound to hydrogens as long as you don't see anything else there. So we got some methyl groups going on there. We got one there, got one there. I also see a carboxyl group right here. So we got that carbon double bound to an oxygen, and it's going to end with the hydroxyl group, and the rest of the molecule is happening. So we got a carboxyl group right there. What about in this molecule? What do you see? definitely see some more of those methyl groups going on there. They're always everywhere. I really want to focus in on this carbon double bonded to this oxygen. This is definitely going to be one of those functional groups. So this one has a chlorine attached to it. So what this carbon double bonded to the oxygen, this is actually going to be a type of carbonyl group, and more specifically, it's going to be a ketone. Because we have a carbon double bonded to the oxygen, we have the rest of the molecule on this side, and we have the rest of the molecule on that side. If it ends with a hydrogen, then it will be an aldehyde, but since there's more things going on, more to the story, this is known as a ketone. What about this molecule right here? I see this carbon double bonded to this oxygen right here, and it's going to end with a hydroxyl group. So this must be a carboxyl group. So we got a carboxyl group right there with all those methyl groups all over the place here. When it comes to this molecule right here, I see a carbon double bonded to an oxygen, and it's going to end with a hydrogen. So this is a aldehyde. So remember, we have a different type of carbonyl group. So this is a carbonyl group, more specifically an aldehyde, because it ends with the hydrogen. With the next molecule that we have here, I definitely see a hydroxyl group going on right here. So I don't see any carbons double bonded to any oxygens, but I do see a hydroxyl group going on there. We also see this group right here for the first time, and this is that amino group. So that nitrogen bound to those hydrogens, so that's going to be our amino group. The next molecule that we have here, I definitely see that amino group going on again. So that nitrogen bound to those hydrogens. We have those methyl groups going on, of course. I have another amino group going on over here. Beautiful, beautiful. I do see, though, a carbon double bonded to an oxygen. So since it is in the middle of the molecule, so there's the rest of the story going on this side, and more to the story on this side. It's not just ending with the hydrogen. We got some other things going on here too than just a hydrogen. So it's definitely not a aldehyde. So this is going to be a ketone. With this molecule right here, I see a hydroxyl group going on. And remember, those hydroxyl groups make things polar. So if it wasn't for that hydroxyl group being there, it would just be a whole bunch of methyl groups going on, and it would be nonpolar. Since we added that hydroxyl group there, it is now polar. With this molecule right here, I see a carbon double bonded to an oxygen, and it's going to end with a hydroxyl group. So this is known as our carboxyl. So remember, carboxyl has a hydroxyl group attached to it. The last functional practice that we'll look at is this molecule here. So I definitely see let's start with this amino group. So we have this amino group going on right here. So it's just a nitrogen, and it's also going to be bound to some hydrogens. We also have this group going on right here. We have this carbon double bonded to the oxygen. And since it's in the middle of the carbon structure here, so we have the rest of the story going on this side, and the rest of the molecule or story going on this side. It's in the middle of this carbon structure, so this is known as a carbonyl group ketone. In the next lecture, we'll get into talking about carbon and the different types of isomers. I'll catch you there. Happy studying.